Another performance function of the FMC is to compute the optimum and maximum altitude for the airplane. During normal operations, when the FMC is operating in econ mode, the optimum altitude displayed is the most economic altitude for the total trip cost. Therefore, this optimum altitude is a function of cost index and airplane weight. If the airplane is operating in a speed control mode, such as at a constant Mach number or at LRC, this optimum altitude is the altitude which will result in the minimum trip fuel. As the optimum altitude increases with decreasing fuel on board, a continuously climbing cruise would be the most cost-effective. But as we all know, ATC will not allow this. In place of a climbing cruise for cost efficiency, choose an initial cruise altitude above the initial optimum for the flight. Remain at this cruise altitude until the optimum altitude has increased above your current altitude sufficiently, then commence a step climb to the highest optimum altitude for the flight. The FMC provides data for crew evaluation for a manually entered step climb altitude on the cruise page of the CDU. This data includes the predicted cost savings or penalty associated with the step climb to the crew entered altitude and the first possible step climb point based on gross weight. The optimum altitude based on the current gross weight is continuously displayed. The ideal flight path will always keep the airplane within 2,000 feet of the optimum altitude to maximize efficiency. The FMC also displays the maximum possible altitude for crew reference at the current target speed. The maximum altitude is the more limiting of the thrust limited altitude, the maneuver margin limited altitude, or the maximum operating altitude. The thrust limited altitude is the highest altitude the airplane can maintain at the maximum cruise thrust rating or climb to at the maximum climb thrust rating. It is dependent on OAT. This calculation of thrust limited altitude is based on residual rate of climb of 100 feet per minute for cruise and 300 feet per minute for the climb phase of flight. This residual climb rates can be altered on the ground only through an FMC maintenance page. In general, the thrust limited altitude as a function of an outside air temperature will be at least 2,000 feet above the optimum altitude where the temperature is ISA plus 15 degrees Celsius. As previously stated, the maximum altitude is also limited by the maneuver margin limited altitude. The maneuver margin limited altitude is determined by computing the G margin to initial buffet at the selected altitude and speed. This computed margin is then compared to the airline selected minimum G margin. The default for the airline selected maneuver margin is 1.3 Gs. If the FMC computes a margin to initial buffet at the selected altitude and speed that is smaller than the airline selected margin, the selected altitude will not be allowed. A 1.2 G margin is the same as a steady 34-degree bank turn. A 1.3 G margin is the same as a steady 39-degree bank turn.